The oil and gas industry didn't just lie about climate change for decades haphazardly. Those who promote annexationism don't work randomly either. If the Canadian people are going to push back successfully, one of the best ways we can do this is to understand how communications are strategically planned. Welcome to another episode of the Environment in Canada podcast, a podcast about the environment in Canada by Sierra Club Canada. I'm Connor Curtis, Head of Communications at Sierra Club Canada, and today we've got another episode of our sub-series called Sovereignty Saturdays. The common theme to these episodes is a focus on countering attempts by the US government to annex Canada with an environmental lens. But these episodes are about more than just that, because to protect Canada's sovereignty and with it the communities and environments we know and love, we need to understand why it's under threat. Around the world, democracy is under attack, and far from being secondary, environmental and energy issues are core to understanding why that's happening. The erosion of rights and democracy anywhere harms us all and hurts our ability to address climate change, biodiversity loss, and make the changes we need to make to have a safe, renewable future. If you haven't yet, I encourage you to go back and listen to our two previous episodes of Sovereignty Saturdays. They are linked below. But this episode, I'm going to be talking about communications planning. When we talk about sovereignty, the actions of the Canadian government will have a great impact on Canada's ability to withstand US aggression. But the actions of us, the Canadian people, will have a far greater impact. In past episodes of Sovereignty Saturdays, we've looked at how oil and gas-aligned interests have been working to undermine Canadian sovereignty. We've also talked about how threats to annex Canada by the US administration have centered around using communications tactics to try and insert and build up some support among a very vocal minority for the idea of the 51st state in Canada, or at least parts of Canada. We've also made a point of centering the role of individual people in pushing back through communications. But how do you win a communications war with the United States? We'll be looking at that subject in this and future episodes, but for this episode, I wanted to chat about the basics. Communications is not just about social media posts and press releases. Behind a lot of the communications you see is strategy. The oil and gas industry didn't just lie about climate change for decades haphazardly. Those who promote annexationism don't work randomly either. If the Canadian people are going to push back successfully, one of the best ways we can do this is to understand how communications are strategically planned. It's hard to play chess successfully if you don't know the rules. So today I'm literally going to go over the general format of a communications plan. This is actually borrowed from corporate communications planning. The point here being to expose the magic trick of communications. I'll be using some examples directly related to the topic to understand each section. Communications plans are much like battle plans. In fact, you'll hear a lot of people who work in public relations and communications use military quotes and references, sometimes even when all they're trying to do is something like sell a brand of soap. I'll admit this episode is probably going to be a bit more technical than others, but it's useful technicality. So the general sections of a communications plan are as follows, and we're going to go through each section. There's the situational analysis, or environmental scan, the audience analysis, objectives, key messages, strategies, tactics or timeline of specific actions, evaluation and measurement. The situational analysis is basically just your first research on the situation. It's literally a summary of what is actually happening as best as you can figure it out. For example, a situational analysis of Canada's situation might look like we are a country next to an increasingly polluting and increasingly authoritarian country, the United States, which is attempting to undermine our sovereignty over the long term by spreading propaganda and applying economic pressure. It could further conclude that oil and gas interests have been aiding in these US efforts using a model of undermining democracy that has been seen elsewhere. More on that in our previous episode, How to Defend Democracy, Sovereignty, and Canada, linked below. The audience analysis is basically an analysis of what audiences are important to speak to in the situation. It might include a breakdown of how influential each audience is, what sort of arguments they are likely to listen to, and how they get their information and when. i.e., do they use social media or are they more likely to watch news on TV, and if so, what shows at what times? For example, the American public is an audience. You'd probably want to break it down more than that, but the American public is an audience, one worth getting a message across to, particularly if you want to say, hey, Canada is a sovereign nation, leave us alone. For example, the government of Ontario is running $75 million worth of anti-tariff ads in the US. They're not just running these ads randomly, they're running them using the voice of Ronald Reagan, and they're targeting more traditional audiences in places they know those audiences watch regularly, like Fox News and ESPN. Whatever you think of that particular ad campaign and its efficacy, you can see how they're trying to get to a specific audience using messaging that might appeal to that audience in a place that audience watches. This is why the audience analysis part of communications planning is so important. If you don't understand your audience, the frames they use to understand the world, and thus the metaphors they will understand, or where they get their information, then you will be communicating with thin air. Now, I want to be careful in making something clear here. Understanding your audience does not mean watering down what you're saying or being less radical about the things you want to say. The climate movement in the past has made the mistake, for instance, of trying to appeal to the middle, quote unquote, by proposing half measures to tackle climate change. And while it's important to understand that change doesn't happen overnight, and sometimes we do need to take things step by step, appealing to an audience doesn't mean telling half-truths or underestimating the seriousness of a situation or watering down the need for action. It just means framing what you want to say in ways the audience will actually understand. For example, we need to fight climate change. It's a serious and urgent problem. But climate change doesn't have a mailing address that you can send letters of protest to. It's also a complex, somewhat abstract concept that not everybody may see the seriousness immediately of it. There's a temptation there, which has existed in the climate movement, to appeal to the middle by saying things like, well, just do your bit, or saying, let's work with big polluters to tackle this complex problem. Those approaches were, as you can see from the climate change all around us, deeply flawed. Instead, the best approach is to refocus from climate change, the abstract concept, to instead talking about the need to confront big corporate polluters who have, for the most part, driven climate change. By calling out big polluters, you're zeroing in on the real problem. There are actual mailing addresses to send those letters of protest to. You're also including people from the middle in doing something about that problem without blaming them for it. And you're not watering down the seriousness of what you're saying. I'll be getting into this more in future episodes, so I'll end this point here, but I recommend checking out our previous episode with Anat Shenker-Arsayo, who talks about that climate change example of how to draw the middle to you rather than appeal to the middle by sacrificing your values. That episode is called Communicating on Climate Change in Your Community. Next in the plan format, we have the objectives. This is what you want to achieve. And this is sometimes harder to define than what you might think, because while we often understand broadly what we want to achieve, defining our goals in a way that can actually be measured is more complicated, and sometimes, frankly, impossible. Sometimes you've just got to have a general goal. Your objectives for a communication plan might be to rally as many Canadians as possible to the risks that the US poses, to make them aware of what's happening, or to rally Americans to the very real risk that the US administration is posing to Canada. But how do you know if you succeed? Here, I want to stress that while you do want to be pragmatic about what you can achieve, you also want to be ambitious. Too many people make the mistake in setting objectives of thinking pragmatism means being cautious only or setting low bars for success. To the contrary, often to be truly pragmatic, one must also be ambitious. This is a bit like training with weights at the gym. If you only ever lift light weights, if you set that as your objective, then yeah, you'll achieve your objective easily. But if you want to actually achieve a difference in, say, strength or muscle mass, you have to lift progressively heavier weights. Remember this too. One of the key tactics entities like oil and gas interests use is self-doubt. They almost always frame themselves as unbeatable, as strong, and they are strong, but not unbeatable. The point of this framing is in part for you to self-defeat before you even challenge them. So it's important not to underestimate an opponent, but it's also vital not to overestimate them either. Ambitious goals paired with reasonable caution and strategic thinking allow one to see the opportunities and risks more clearly. So in setting objectives, try to be both bold and reasonable. Next are key messages, and here I want to stress that these are just your key messages. They are the framework of what you want to say, though how exactly you phrase them might depend upon the audience you're speaking to and what you know about them and the sort of messages they will understand and likely agree with. It's best to keep these to 3 key messages, possibly even 2. People are busy, we are bombarded by information almost all the time, and it's legitimately difficult to keep track of everything. 3 key messages is sort of the maximum you want because it's the maximum most people are going to be able to remember after seeing a communications material that you create. For example, if you want to counter 51st state rhetoric by launching a messaging campaign for an American audience aimed at getting across Canadians' desire for continued independence, 3 key messages might be: 1. Canadians value our country and have no desire to become a US state. 2. We do care about our American neighbors, and we know the vast majority of you understand our position. 3. Help us advocate for Canada by calling out the aggression of the US administration. 3 key messages. But in coming up with your messages again, be sure to frame them in a way that makes sense to your audience but doesn't internalize framing that ultimately undercuts your argument. You want to control the narrative, not let it control you. In fact, letting narratives control us is one of the biggest mistakes I see in response to the situations we face, whether it's the climate crisis or the rise in authoritarianism south of the border and its implications for Canada. It's all about framing, not what's being discussed, but how we discuss it. For example, there's still absolutely no business case for shipping Canadian liquefied natural gas, or LNG, to Europe, despite rising energy uses of artificial intelligence. But in a lot of news media, when there's an obstacle, like complete economic infeasibility to building new LNG, oil, and gas infrastructure, this obstacle is framed as an obstacle to be overcome, even though it's an insurmountable problem. But when there's a need to build out some energy storage and grids to make the most of renewable energy sources like wind and solar, in the media this is often framed as an insurmountable obstacle when it is not. It's a fixable problem. When drafting messages, don't accept framing that puts you at a disadvantage. Challenge it with your own framing. And that brings us to the next stage, which is strategy. This is the general approach you will take to using your messages and tactics to reach key audiences and achieve your objectives. For example, using the key messages above that we talked about, convincing Americans to help support Canada. If you wanted to reach a group of people in the United States who you think might make for good allies of Canadian sovereignty, your strategy might be: reach people with key messages in the United States who are frequent travelers to Canada by submitting opinion pieces to local newspapers in US border towns. And you don't just have to have one strategy. Another strategy example aimed at exactly the same objective might be: create social media groups of allies of Canada in the US, and using existing contacts you have, then slowly try to get more people to join those groups. A good strategy usually gets a bit more specific than the examples I'm using here, but you don't want to be overly specific in strategies. You can spend all week trying to come up with the perfect strategy, and then by the end of the week, the situation has changed, and all the overly specific details of your strategy will need to change too, setting you back to square one. Good strategy should flow naturally from your situational analysis, your objectives, your key messages, and your audience analysis. The specifics are handled by tactics. Tactics are a timeline of specific actions you are going to take and when you plan to take them, and who will be responsible for what actions. For example, who sets up that Facebook group, and when, who administers it, and how often will you post to it and what? How many articles will you write to local papers, and what will their specific pitches be? All your actions, your tactics, should flow from the strategies you have set up using the key messages you have chosen in ways that match the audiences they are reaching. But again, be prepared to make changes here on short notice. The modern communications landscape is complex and constantly shifting. There's often too much happening to know several months ahead what exact tactic, whether it be a protest or an op-ed or a social media post, will work in a given moment. It's better to have a tool belt of tactics that you can develop that you can then put into motion more rapidly while still following the general outline your strategy has laid out. It's important to learn from others and from experts in communications, but past that, you will often need to test different tactics in different contexts to try things to see if they work. And a tactic that didn't work in one context may work in another. However, if you have a good strategy based on a good analysis of what's happening and who's involved, the tactics you need to use should become clearer. For example, we know the US administration doesn't really seem to care much about the well-being of the US people, but does seem to care a lot about the profit margins of a very few wealthy people. So if you're going to put pressure on the administration to back off threatening Canada, you would want to do so with things that put pressure on those specific oligarchs. Things like the digital service tax on big tech companies. The intense reaction, in fact, of the US administration to the digital services tax is itself proof that that's a weak spot. And to my mind, scrapping it and giving up a key bargaining chip was not a good idea. But whatever your feelings on the digital services tax, keep that example in mind. Because it's not just enough to know what you care about. You need to understand what other people care about too. And oligarchs care about money and influence. And that leads us to the final component, the most important element of a communications plan: evaluation and measurement. Remember when I said there was an art to picking the right objectives and figuring out how you're going to measure them? We've now come full circle. In order to know if your messages, tactics, and strategies are actually working, you need to measure progress. This can be hard to do and extremely context-specific, but it's important to take a step back from what you're doing when analyzing it and think creatively. If something isn't working, ask why it isn't, and if it might work with some modification. The point of this step is not to declare victory or defeat, but to see where and how you might want to adjust course. There's a whole lecture series I could give on this aspect of a communications plan, so instead I'll just give you a few pointers. First of all, a reminder that if you're promoting something like renewable energy or pushing back against something like annexationism, the other side will want you to give up. They will probably do everything they can to tire you out to make it look like they're winning, and so you need to read between the lines. Secondly, not all data is equal. For instance, data on social media engagement and media coverage of your topic does not equate to public opinion. The best way to determine public opinion is through polling, which is kind of expensive, so you kind of have to go off what other people are doing in polling, but not all polling is also equal. Polling can ask questions that are biased. Even reputable pollsters make this mistake sometimes, and it's really important to see who commissioned a poll, as polls themselves get weaponized. It's also important to actually read the data from the polling in depth and read between the lines, not just the summary someone puts up about the poll afterward. And even if polling looks bad to your cores, actually looking in for the opportunities in the details of that polling. Are there maybe ways to use different messaging slightly or to talk about this issue a different way is really crucial. Always try to look for the opportunity in the crisis, not just what's gone wrong. And again, without watering down your message, because if there's one thing that's true no matter what the polling, it's that nobody respects somebody who seems to stand for nothing but what they think is popular. For example, a lot of the polling showing widespread support for things in Canada like pipelines has problems in terms of what questions were asked and how that information is framed. And we actually did a previous podcast episode on 65% of Canadians supporting renewable energy instead of oil and gas that talks a little bit about this and how when you actually put renewable energy and oil and gas next to each other, people overwhelmingly favor renewable energy development. Largely, I think those problems are actually also a function of the fact that many pollsters aren't as exposed to the intricacies of environmental issues and energy issues as perhaps you and I are. There's also a question of a trade-off of time spent on evaluating what you're doing versus doing it. If you're spending most of your time planning, debating strategy, or trying to figure out if what you're doing is working, then you're probably not spending much time actually communicating with people. That's another big problem I see. Some people just can't be swayed on an issue, and you'll be wasting your time trying no matter what strategies, tactics, and messages you use. Some people probably already agree with you, and figuring out how to work together is good, but you need to balance that internal networking with actually bringing people in from that general public who are undecided towards you. And you don't want to overthink all this. Don't waste your time arguing with other people on strategy and tactics unless there's a real reason to have a discussion. In fact, work with others even if you don't agree with all their tactics and strategies, so long as the overall goal is the same, unless there's a real reason not to. Like they really don't want to work collaboratively or it's undercutting everything that the movement you're part of is trying to do. And there just doesn't seem to be a way to resolve it. And even then, you may not be able to stop somebody else from doing what they're going to do, but just think about how that ties into or might even support what you want to do as well. How can you improvise off of what each other are doing, even if it's different? There's an aspect here of full spectrum resistance, which we got into in another podcast that I will link below. It's a strategy of organizing that emphasizes different strategies and different tactics towards a shared goal. And thanks again to Jessica Murray, who conducted that podcast for us. If you're spending time arguing with each other, you're losing time reaching your audience, and time is the most valuable resource. Instead, just share advice and lessons learned, do trainings on how to use new forms of communication, on effective framing, and actually get experience communicating with people and see what works. you do not need to write out a full communications plan following this format for everything that you do. This is just a framework designed to help you think more strategically about what you're doing. This wouldn't be a proper podcast on public relations strategy without a good military history reference, so I'm going to cite the Battle of Trafalgar here. And somewhat ironically, I am going to quote from an article from the US Naval Institute that I'll link to below and that you might find strategically insightful in a communications sense. On the eve of his greatest victory, Vice Admiral Horatio Nelson told his subordinate commanders, in case signals can neither be seen or perfectly understood, no captain can do very wrong if he places his ship alongside that of the enemy. A fictionalized Nelson also told Captain Jack Aubrey, never mind the maneuvers, just go straight at him. Although cited as an example of Nelson's fighting spirit, the simple advice to close with the enemy was couched within a detailed plan for the upcoming Battle of Trafalgar. Nelson knew his force was better in gunnery and maneuver, with better training and more experience than his French and Spanish enemies. But he did not want his commanders maneuvering for a perfect engagement when the tools of victory lay close at hand. The plan could not be an excuse for inaction. One lesson here, in that quote from the US Naval Academy, is that plans are not the same as action, and knowing generally your strengths and your opponent's weaknesses is sometimes more important than figuring out the perfect plan. In the modern world of communications, again, things move quickly, and trying to control everything from the top down is just not possible most of the time. The other lesson here is to focus on training and sharing with each other what you learn and what works. In that sense, anyone faced with a new communication situation can understand themselves what needs to be done tactically to fulfill an overall strategy, even without orders from above. This is actually how modern militaries work, and have worked largely since World War II. Orders from higher up the chain of command are more general and focus on the broader strategy and objectives, and those higher levels focus on training. And it's up to commanders in the field to interpret that strategy through choosing the immediate tactics used, because they actually know what's happening right in front of them. It's about strategy meeting flexibility and actual experience, and going and doing the thing and learning from it. And thus today's podcast. I truly believe if more people understand how communications planning, communications strategy, and communications framing work, then the world can become a better place, because people will be able to push back for themselves when facing things like disinformation, annexationism, or climate denial. We've got our role here at the club in helping to fix the problems we face, but no one organization can fix them all, which is why we focus so much on bringing people together and sharing tools. Climate denialists and annexationists are, past the immediate ridiculousness sometimes, very strategic. They also spend huge amounts of time actually communicating with others, whether you take that communication as good or not, and trying out new methods of spreading their message. Each and every one of us who cares about the environment and about sovereignty should aim to be just as effective and dedicated. In the long run, as we covered in last week's episode about No King's Day, fixing these problems is going to mean dealing with the inequality that led us to this point where disinformation is such a big problem, and climate change has gotten so bad that we are having to deal with these massive impacts on a regular basis. You can find that episode linked below. But even in dealing with those more core problems, being good at communications is going to be key. I said in previous podcasts that no one is coming to the rescue but all of us working together. And I meant it. So whatever you do, don't forget, the way you communicate makes a difference. Before we end today, just a reminder that you can take action on environmental issues by visiting sierraclub.ca. We have tons of petitions, other actions and events, and regular news updates you can sign up for on the homepage. You can also find Sierra Club Canada on social media, and you can listen to the Environment in Canada podcast on the Harbinger Media Network, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, iHeartRadio, and YouTube, or wherever you get your podcasts. This podcast also airs on CKUT Broadcast Radio in Montreal, 90.3 FM bi-weekly on Tuesdays at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Don't forget to click follow or subscribe so you get the latest episodes from us.